Derek learns that his life has been nothing but an illusion. Emily betrayed him with a man he never could have imagined in his family. But there's another twist. McKen, the same man who exposed his weakness, has been manipulating everything. Bella brings the terrifying truth Derek could never have imagined. How will he react to these shocking revelations? Betrayal, manipulation, and unexpected revenge. It's all ahead. Derek had always believed that his marriage to Emily was strong. She worked long hours, spending 12 hours in the office, and he understood her exhaustion. He, himself, was a writer, a person who lived through stories, so it wasn't hard for him to imagine how difficult it was for her to keep up with such a fast-paced life. But lately, something had changed. When Emily decided to quit her job, he supported her. She said she wanted to find something new, to finally breathe freely. Derek thought it was the best decision for her. But he didn't expect that just a week after quitting, she would start acting differently. She came home late, and her phone was always on silent. But most importantly, there was something new in her eyes, something foreign. One evening, when Emily came home late, Derek decided to ask her directly, "Where have you been?" She seemed a little embarrassed, but quickly composed herself. "At a friend's," she said, not looking him in the eye. She had never lied to him before. At least, he thought so. The next day, he started noticing more details. New expensive things in her wardrobe, expensive perfume she hadn't had before. She said she got money from her last paycheck. But when Derek checked their joint bank account, there were no changes. Something wasn't right. One time, he accidentally overheard her talking on the phone in the bathroom. "Yes, I'll be there." No, he doesn't suspect anything. Derek felt his hands grow cold. That evening, he decided to take action. He needed to find out the truth. Derek couldn't sleep that night. His thoughts were racing around Emily's words, her mysterious phone calls, and the strange changes in her behavior. He had always trusted his wife, but something told him that now she wasn't being honest with him. In the morning, he made himself some coffee and sat down with his laptop, trying to work, but the words wouldn't come together. His imagination, which usually helped him create new stories, now painted him the worst pictures. When Emily came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, he noticed something new, a faint mark on her neck, looking like a scratch. "What's this?" he asked, pointing at it. Emily touched her neck as if she hadn't noticed the mark before. "Oh, it's nothing. Probably scratched myself while getting dressed." She said it so casually, as if it was no big deal, and quickly looked away. But Derek knew her well enough to see the falsehood. He decided not to continue the conversation. Not yet. That day, he decided to check where she went after work. Officially, she no longer worked in the office, but still left the house early and returned late. She said she was looking for a new job and going to interviews. Derek waited until she left and quietly followed her. Emily didn't go to any office or interview. She headed downtown and went into an expensive boutique. Through the window, Derek saw her trying on a dress and then paying for it with a credit card without hesitation. Where did she get the money? They had never been rich, and after her quitting, their expenses should have decreased. But it seemed the opposite was happening. Derek felt his chest tighten. He decided to keep following her. Emily left the boutique, got into a taxi, and went to another part of the city. She stopped in front of a nightclub. He had never seen her in places like this. It wasn't her scene. Derek hid behind the corner of a building and watched. A few minutes later, the nightclub doors opened, and a man in an expensive suit came out to meet her. Tall, fit, with a confident smile. They hugged, not just in a friendly way. Something inside Derek broke. He didn't know who this man was, but he could see that he was more than just an acquaintance to Emily. They stood too close to each other. Her hand gently touched his wrist as they talked. Derek forced himself not to rush over there right now. He needed evidence. He took several photos on his phone. Emily with the man in the suit. He remembered the name of the club, Lust. That evening, when she came home, Derek said nothing. He just stared at her, trying to understand when she became the kind of person who lies so easily. "How was your day?" he asked as usual. "Good. I had an interview, then I met with a friend." "Which one?" "Anna, you don't know her." Another lie. Derek nodded, pretending to believe her. He decided to find out more. The next day, He went on social media and began searching for information about the nightclub, Lust. It quickly turned out that the owner of the establishment was an influential businessman, Mr. McKen. McKen, the same name he had accidentally overheard in Emily's conversation. He searched for a photo of this man and immediately recognized him. It was the same one who had hugged his wife outside the club. What was she doing with him? The next evening, when Emily said she was going for another interview, Derek decided to do the impossible. He entered the nightclub, Lust. The club turned out to be expensive and luxurious. Derek ordered a drink and settled at a table in the shadows. He observed, and he saw her. Emily. She was not alone. She was sitting with Mr. McKen in the VIP section, laughing, touching his hand, looking nothing like she did at home. Happy. Then McKen said something, and she stood up. And then Derek understood everything. Emily went on stage. She worked here. She was entertaining the guests. He could no longer stay in the shadows. Derek stood up and headed toward the VIP section, his heart pounding in his chest. When Emily noticed him, her face went pale. Derek, how long were you planning to tell me the truth? His voice was calm, but there was anger burning in his eyes. McKen turned to him with an indifferent smile. You're probably her husband. Derek clenched his fists. Emily remained silent. Now she knew the game was over. Derek remained silent, trying to keep his composure as the scene unfolded in front of him, a scene he could never have imagined. His wife stood on stage, wearing a dress he had never seen her wear at home. She was laughing, talking to the men sitting in the VIP section, including McKen. There was no shame or fear in her eyes. She looked confident, as if this was her element. Derek felt his fingers clench into fists. There was no doubt in his mind. She had been lying to him all this time. The money that had suddenly appeared, her late-night meetings with friends, the expensive items. He watched all of this, and one question pulsed in his head. When did she stop being the woman he married? His first instinct was to approach her, publicly expose her, and force her to stop. But he knew that if he caused a scene now, she would find a way to justify herself. She would lie again. He decided to handle it differently. He silently turned around and left the club. That night, he couldn't sleep. The images from what he had seen kept him awake. She wasn't just cheating on him. She was leading a double life. And this new life brought her more joy than their marriage. Derek began to analyze everything. Her words, her excuses, her new confidence. She had changed. She was no longer the Emily he knew. In the morning, she came home, unaware that he had seen everything. She acted as if nothing had happened, just like every time before. He watched her, how she drank her coffee, how she typed something on her phone, how she carefully hid her smile when she received a message. "How was your night?" he asked calmly. Emily looked up at him and slightly tensed. "Good," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "I just met with the girls." Derek nodded. He wasn't going to reveal his hand yet. Not now. That same day, he started to take action. He focused on what he did best, history. But this time, it wasn't fiction. He wrote down every detail, her behavior, her lies, her words. He started gathering evidence, analyzing her conversations, keeping track of her finances. And the more he found, the more he was convinced. She hadn't just gotten a lover. She was playing a bigger game. 2 days later, he went back to the club. He no longer hid. He wasn't just curious about what she was doing there. He wanted to understand what was behind it all. He walked inside, ordered a drink, and began observing. Emily was there. She was talking to McKen. Her voice sounded confident. She was laughing, touching his hand. She looked happy. McKen said something, and she leaned in closer. Derek saw it clearly. Her look, the intimate moment. He understood one thing. His wife belonged to this world more than she belonged to him. But what would happen if he destroyed this world for her? He waited for a moment when McKen walked away and approached her. "How long were you planning to hide this?" Emily flinched. She quickly turned her head and saw him. For a moment, fear appeared in her eyes, then she tried to hide it. "Derek, what are you doing here?" He stared directly at her. "I could ask you the same thing." She swallowed. "It's not what you think." "Really?" He smiled. but there was no warmth in his eyes. Then explain it to me. Emily nervously looked around, as if searching for an escape. It's just work. I'm not doing anything wrong. And McKen? Is he part of this work too? Her lips tightened. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. She remained silent. Then there's your answer. He shook his head. You're not even trying to justify yourself. Derek, let's talk at home. She took a step closer, but he stepped back. You lost that, right? He turned around and walked away. She didn't follow him. Derek left the club, but he didn't feel relief. This was just the beginning. He couldn't just walk away and forget about everything. He had to make her regret it deeply. Derek left the club, but instead of anger or despair, he felt a strange, cold calm. Now he had a clear goal. He was no longer a confused man, doubting himself and his suspicions. He knew the truth, and he knew what he had to do. He didn't go home right away. He needed to think it through. He went into the nearest cafe, ordered a strong black coffee, and pulled out his phone. He needed a plan. He could just leave and divorce her, leaving everything behind. But that was too simple. Emily didn't deserve an easy way out. She had made a fool of him, lied to his face, and let him believe that they were still a couple. He opened her social media. Recently, she hadn't posted anything personal. She only pretended that everything was fine. But when he looked at her followers, his eyes caught one profile. Jonathan McKen. Derek clicked on the profile and started browsing through the photos. McKen was the typical influential man who loved showing off his wealth, expensive cars, elite parties, trips abroad. But there was something else. In several photos, women were standing next to him. Not one, not too many. And among them was Emily. The photos weren't intimate, but they spoke volumes. She was not the only one. Derek felt his lips curl into a slow smile. This was even better than he had hoped. He understood that McKen was a player. He had fun, used women, and then discarded them when they were no longer needed. And if Emily thought she was special, that her story would be different, she was deeply mistaken. Derek took a few screenshots and sent them to his computer. He knew he could use this, but it wasn't enough. The next day, he acted. He waited until Emily went off to meet her friends again and then followed her. He didn't go to the club. He knew it was pointless to search for her there. Instead, he checked where she went when she wasn't home. An hour later, he found her in a restaurant owned by McKen. She was sitting at a table, drinking wine and waiting. Not for McKen, for another man. He looked younger than McKen, but also in an expensive suit, a stylish haircut, and a pricey watch. Derek took a closer look. This was one of McKen's partners, if social media was to be believed. Emily was playing a dangerous game. She wasn't just friendly with McKen. She was using his influence for her own benefit. Derek smiled and took a few more photos. Now, he had leverage. The next morning, he acted. Emily came home late at night, not even bothering to make up an excuse. She just smiled at him, as usual, and went to the shower. While she was in there, Derek sat down at the computer and sent out the photos. He sent them to McKen. He sent them to the partner she was meeting with. And most importantly, he sent them to a few large anonymous accounts that loved sensational stories about the rich and influential. He didn't wait for a reply. He just calmly went to sleep. By morning, everything exploded. When Emily woke up, her phone was already buzzing with calls and messages. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and went pale. What is this? Derek stretched, pretending to have just woken up. What's wrong, darling? She looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, there was no indifference in her gaze, only real fear. Her world had just started to crumble. Emily couldn't understand what was happening. Her phone was buzzing with messages, calls, notifications from unknown accounts. She quickly checked the first message. It was a screenshot of a photo of her and McKen, with the caption, "Relationships with rich businessmen?" Yes, it's definitely business. She instinctively reached out to check the next message, but a dark spot blurred her vision. "Derek!" she exclaimed, turning sharply to him. Her voice was anxious, but still slightly muffled. "What is this? Who did this?" Derek sat on the bed, calmly sipping his coffee, taking his time to respond. He watched her panic, not understanding what was happening. "What exactly?" he asked, as if nothing unusual had happened. She looked back at the screen, then at him. You spread all of this, didn't you? You did this, didn't you? Derek leaned forward, placed his cup on the nightstand, and looked at her. I just helped the truth find its place. Emily shuddered at these words. She still hadn't realized what this would lead to. You have no idea what you've just done? Her voice trembled. But it was no longer anger. It was panic. This is going to be all over the city. You can't just leave it like this. Derek smiled again. But this time his smile wasn't soft. It was a cold, calculated expression. Maybe you're right. I can't. But I want you to understand one simple thing, Emily. You thought I didn't notice. You thought you could keep this a secret. But I saw everything. I saw every little detail. You weren't just cheating on me. You were living in a different world, and I had no idea about it. She took a step towards him, almost running, but stopped when she realized that he was no longer the person she knew. Derek, please, I can't just leave everything like this. It's not how you think. McKen and all those others. It's just part of the job. He raised his hand, stopping her. No more lies. I've seen everything. You weren't just working. You were playing a game you couldn't win. You thought I would stay faithful, that I'd just sit at home and not notice while you went out with McKen and other men until you got bored. Emily looked around, confused. All her efforts, all the excuses she had made, now seemed empty. Derek wasn't buying them. Her image, the one she had so carefully built, was falling apart right before her eyes. It's all because of you. You pushed me to this, she shouted, ripping off the mask of despair. You always stayed at home, writing your books, while I worked, earned money, kept everything on my shoulders. I'm tired. I needed more than just this life. Derek shook his head wearily, as if not believing what he was hearing. You're so quick to blame everything on me. You're tired, Emily? What about me? What about me? When you lied to me every day? What about me? When you cheated on me with every new man who showed up in your life? You weren't tired of that. You were just living in a comfortable lie where everything was allowed. She didn't respond. She just looked into his eyes. But now there was not only despair in her gaze but also doubt. She understood that she couldn't turn away from this. Everything she had built had crumbled in an instant. But she wasn't going to give up. I'm leaving, she said sharply, taking off the mask of the victim. I won't let it end like this. If you want to break everything, then go ahead. But I will find my way. And you'll regret doing this. Derek didn't reply. He just silently watched as she grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. He knew this wasn't the end. He wouldn't let her walk away so easily. As she walked, his mind kept working. He knew he couldn't just let her go, even if it would be best for him. This wasn't just a marriage. This was a war, and he wasn't ready to lose. He went to the door and closed it when she was already on the stairs. Emily, his voice was firm. She stopped without turning. You still don't understand. I've only just begun. This is just the beginning of your end. She stood there, silently staring into the darkness, slightly hunched from his words. And even if she refused to admit it, she felt it. Something had changed. He wouldn't be the same anymore. He wouldn't be waiting for her apology. And he definitely wouldn't let her leave without consequences. She turned and left. And this time Derek was sure. This was a step with no turning back. Derek stood by the window, watching Emily walk quickly down the street, clutching her phone in her hand. He saw her nervous movements, her confused gaze. She was typing something, probably trying to contact McKen or someone else who was still on her side. He returned to the room, feeling a strange relief. She was gone. But that didn't mean she would just disappear from his life. He knew her well. She wasn't the type to give up without a fight. She would act. Derek sat down at his laptop and opened his social media again. He expected to see chaos. And he wasn't wrong. McKen's name had already appeared on several news accounts, and all the posts were about him and some mysterious woman who worked for him. In the comments, people were coming up with theories. Some thought she was McKen's new lover. Others assumed she was just one of his many affairs. But then Derek saw something that surprised him. One of the comments was from Emily herself. Everything is a lie. I will sue those spreading fake news. Derek couldn't help but smile. She was panicking. He knew it would be hard for her to find a way out of this situation. McKen had probably already found out everything. And if he was a smart man, he would do exactly what Derek expected. He would reject her. The phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but he had no doubt who it was. Yes? At the other end of the line, heavy breathing was heard, followed by a familiar voice. You made a mistake, Derek. McKen. Derek leaned back in his chair, trying not to reveal his satisfied smile. I only uncovered the truth, he said calmly. Do you consider that a mistake? You're playing a game in which you don't know the rules. McKen's voice remained even, but there was anger in it now. I could destroy you for this. Derek raised an eyebrow mockingly. You could, but you won't. And why's that? Because now all the attention is on you. If something happens to me, everyone will know who's behind it. You don't want more press attention, do you? McKen fell silent. Derek continued. Listen, I even helped you. I cleared your name. You don't want people to think you're involved with someone like Emily, do you? You can just distance yourself from her, and everyone will believe she's to blame for everything. You know that's the best option. McKen was silent again, but now Derek sensed something else in the silence. Not anger. Reflection. She worked for you, Derek went on. You didn't give her any guarantees, promised her nothing. Just say you have nothing to do with her, and that's it. McKen sighed. You're playing this game well, Derek. I'm just using your methods. If she gets into trouble, it'll be on your conscience. Derek smiled. She chose this path herself. The conversation ended. Derek put the phone down and closed his eyes. His bet had worked. He didn't know how quickly McKen would distance himself from Emily, but he was sure it would happen. McKen didn't need unnecessary problems. Now all he had to do was wait for Emily to realize that no one wanted her anymore. The next day, he got confirmation. Emily appeared at the door of the apartment. She looked different. Her confidence was gone. Her face showed despair. She didn't even try to pretend to be strong. Derek. Her voice was weak. He looked at her without inviting her inside. McKen dumped me, she said, lowering her head. He didn't respond. He said I can't work at the club anymore. That I ruined his reputation. She looked up, and he saw tears in her eyes. I have nothing left, Derek. He nodded. Yes, I know. She blinked, not understanding what he meant. You're not going to leave me, are you? He stared at her for a long time. What have you left me? She was confused. Derek, please. He sighed. Go, Emily. She couldn't believe it. What? Go. This isn't your home anymore. But I have nowhere to go. That's your problem. She sniffled. You used to love me. I loved you. Once. She took a step back. So this is it? You're just going to leave me? He nodded. Like you left me when you chose to lie. Emily was silent. She stood there for a few seconds, as if hoping he would change his mind. But he didn't. She turned around and left. And this time, he knew she wouldn't come back. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes full of despair, but Derek didn't feel any pity. He had been waiting for this moment, and now, when she had lost everything, he wanted her to feel the emptiness she had created for herself. She looked at him for a few more seconds, as if hoping he would change his decision, but Derek remained unmoved. Finally, realizing that nothing would change, she turned away and left. The door closed, and silence filled the apartment. Derek slowly exhaled. He didn't feel joy or relief, just emptiness. This was the end he had been heading toward. But did that mean he had one? He didn't go through all of this just to stand in silence, staring at the wall. He needed something more. He sat back down at his laptop and opened the news. The story with McKen was already dying down. People had found a new sensation, and soon, no one would remember the scandal. McKen himself hadn't made any statements, just ignored the situation, as expected. Derek drank the last of his cold coffee and got up. He didn't want to stay in this apartment anymore, where every corner reminded him of the past. He grabbed his jacket and went outside. The city was living its own life, and that was even good. No one noticed him. No one asked questions. He walked down familiar streets, trying to collect his thoughts, until he realized he was heading to the same cafe where he had sat before, when he was planning his revenge. He entered the cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. His gaze accidentally caught a familiar figure. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but when the woman turned her head, he immediately recognized her. Bella McKen, the wife of the man he had just destroyed. She noticed him too. For a moment, an intense silence hung between them, but then she stood up and walked over to him. "Can I join you?" Her voice was calm, but there was exhaustion in her eyes. Derek nodded. She sat opposite him and took a sip from her cup, looking at him over the edge. "You were the one who started all of this, weren't you?" He didn't lie. "Yes." She smiled, but without joy. "I thought so." There was a pause. She seemed neither angry nor disappointed, but rather curious. "Why did you do it?" Derek thought for a moment and then said, "Because she deserved it." Bella nodded, briefly looking away. She was foolish if she thought she could play with McKen. He doesn't get attached to people. Derek looked at her intently. "And you know this from experience?" She quietly laughed. "Oh yes, but I managed to survive. And you know what's the strangest thing? I don't feel any regret. She got what she deserved." Derek watched her, realizing they had something in common. They had both destroyed something that once seemed unbreakable. "So what now?" he asked. Bella shrugged. "I look ahead, and you should do the same." Derek smiled. "Maybe." She stood up. "If you want to talk, you'll find me." He didn't answer, just watched as she left the cafe and disappeared among the crowd. He finished his coffee and realized that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel anger, resentment, but freedom. Derek sat in the cafe for a while longer, staring out the window. His thoughts were on the conversation with Bella. She was nothing like he had imagined McKen's wife. Calm, cold-blooded, yet somehow real. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing her own game, just much smarter than Emily. He sighed and opened his phone. There were no messages from Emily, no attempts to apologize, no hysterics. She had disappeared. It was even surprising. He had expected her to try to convince him to reconsider, to return, or at least demand something in the end. But she had just disappeared. That was unsettling. He stood up, paid for his coffee, and went outside. He didn't feel like going home. It was unbearable to sit among the things that had once belonged to her, surrounded by memories that now seemed meaningless. He walked a few steps down the street before feeling that someone was following him. He glanced around casually. Nothing suspicious. People were going about their business, cars passed by. But the feeling didn't go away. He continued walking, listening to every sound. A few minutes later, he stopped at a traffic light and checked his reflection in a store window. That's when he saw her. Emily. She was standing a little behind, half hidden behind a newsstand, watching him. Derek barely held back a smile. So, she hadn't given up after all. He slowly crossed the street and headed toward a small park. He knew she would follow him. He was curious to see how far she was willing to go. He stopped by the fountain and pretended to look for something on his phone. After a few seconds, he heard someone carefully approach from behind. "Are you following me, Emily?" She flinched, but quickly composed herself. "We need to talk." Derek turned around and crossed his arms over his chest. "About what? About how you lied to me? Or about how no one wants you now?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she took a deep breath and said, "I want a chance to explain everything." "You lost it," he cut her off. "Derek, listen. McKen, it was a mistake. I thought he could give me what you never did, but he just used me." "And you didn't use me?" She faltered. "It was different." "Really?" Emily shrugged, looking away. "I did something stupid, but I can't turn back time." "That's true." She took a step closer. "But we can find a way to fix everything." Derek tilted his head. "And how would we do that?" "Give me a chance to come back?" He was surprised. "Are you serious? I know what I've done, but we've been together so long. I can change everything. I want to fix it." He looked her straight in the eyes. "You don't want me, Emily. You just don't want to be alone." She didn't answer. "It's too late," he said and walked away, not even looking back. But as he left the park, one unsettling fact settled in his mind. Emily wasn't the type to give up easily, and he felt like this wasn't the end. Derek walked through the city, his steps heavy and his thoughts even heavier. It seemed like this day had no end. He still didn't have a clear answer to the question of what to do with his life, but one thing was certain. He could no longer live in a lie. He had learned that the life he had so carefully built was actually an illusion. Emily had betrayed him with a man he couldn't even imagine being in his family. She had torn apart something that, for him, was not just a relationship but a true bond. But despite her betrayal, Derek still felt some strange uncertainty. It was hard for him to let go of Emily completely. All these years they had been together, and although he knew she had manipulated him, something still kept him in the dark uncertainty. But now, as she tried to return, he couldn't just let go. Of course, she wanted to come back not because of love, that was obvious. She was simply afraid of being alone. He returned home, but couldn't stay there long. The feeling of emptiness and the lack of real emotions in his relationship made him leave again. And then, he received a message on his phone. "Derek, meet me. I know this isn't over." It was Bella McKen's number. She was cold and distant, but there was a confidence in her words that made Derek pause. She was, essentially, one of those who had influence over the situation, but why did she want to meet now? He sent a short reply, agreeing to the meeting. 30 minutes later, he was sitting at a table in a cafe, waiting for her to arrive. Would this be another maneuver from her side? Maybe she wanted to pull him back into a game he no longer wanted to hear about. Bella appeared unexpectedly quietly, with the same calm expression on her face, but her eyes were different. They gleamed with a hidden intensity. "You wouldn't mind having coffee with a woman who knows more than you think," she said, sitting next to him. Derek responded silently, waiting for her to continue. "I know what you think about your wife, but there's something you need to know. You can't ignore this." Her words carried weight that couldn't be ignored. "What exactly?" he asked. "That McKen didn't just betray you, and that Emily wasn't the only one who made a mistake." Bella looked at him with a serious gaze, and his heart started racing faster. "You're not talking about what I think you are," Derek said, trying not to show how nervous this conversation made him. "That McKen paid your friends to create an illusion of perfect relationships for you, and many other things." Bella didn't take her eyes off him. "You don't see everything, Derek, and I know you don't even realize how it all came together." He sat silently, processing her words. If this was true, everything that had happened was much more complicated than it had seemed at first. He felt stunned, but couldn't allow himself to show it. "Don't you think this is getting too complicated?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "I don't know who to trust anymore." Bella only smiled. "You trusted the wrong people, Derek. McKen didn't just expose your weakness. He manipulated everything you loved and destroyed you from the inside. He knew exactly where to strike." Derek looked at her again, as though seeing someone who knew more than he was ready to accept. And his thoughts began to revolve around one idea. What if what he had seen wasn't the end, but just the beginning? While he tried to make sense of her words, Bella received a message on her phone. She glanced at the screen, then hid it before looking back at Derek. Her gaze was serious. "McKen wants you to know the truth," she said quietly, "but he's scared. You're now his enemy, and he's already preparing for his final move. Do you think Derek will find justice and get revenge on McKen, or will he fall into an even bigger trap?"